Kia ora koutou, and welcome to our panellists and to everyone joining us via Skype this evening. We're here to discuss the proposed unitary plan changes in relation to water tanks. It's great to have you here tonight. Given the emergence of COVID, we're making a shift to using online platforms for engagement. As it is still a relatively new approach for us, please bear with us if we experience any technical difficulties this evening. So now for an overview of tonight's webinar. The purpose of tonight's discussion is for our panel of experts to answer any questions people may have about the proposed unitary plan changes relating to rainwater tanks. We hope that this will assist you in making a formal submission, which can be done through the AK Have Your Say website. Tonight's session will last approximately 60 minutes. It will be recorded and made available on the AK Have Your Say website. Answers to any questions asked during registration, the session or afterwards will also be available on the AK Have Your Say website. In a moment, I'll ask the panellists to introduce themselves, and I also have a few questions that I'd like to ask them. Viewers, please feel free to message through any questions that you have, and I'll direct them to the panellists. Okay, let's begin. Andrew, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about the proposed unitary plan change for rainwater tanks? Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Amy. Kia ora everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name's Andrew Chin. I'm the Head of Healthy Waters Strategy at Auckland Council. And at the Healthy Waters Department, we've been very supportive of getting a rain tank program up and running. It's not just the plan change for us about making rain tanks easier. We see the benefits of rainwater tanks for both stormwater mitigation, as well as managing people's demand, as well as improving the resilience of the community. So we've had a long-running ambition to see more people get rainwater tanks. In particular for this coming summer, there's those residents like myself who live in the rural areas of Auckland who rely on rainwater tanks. We'd desperately like people to get another rainwater tank if they can before this coming summer, as well as those people who are not in the rural areas but would like to get a rainwater tank for using for those non-potable reasons. So say you want to water your garden, clean your boat, clean your house. Using rainwater is a wonderful alternative to the main supply. So thank you very much, and back to you, Amy.
Thanks for that introduction, Andrew. Also today with us we have Chris from Watercare. Chris, can you please give us a quick introduction and provide any thoughts on Watercare's position on enabling rainwater tank use? Thanks, Chris. Chris, sorry about that. We weren't able to quite hear you. Were you able to repeat that? Okay, apologies everybody. It seems we're having some technical issues with Chris. What I might do now is just shift over to Phil. Phil, could you please introduce yourself and provide us with a bit of background to the unitary plan changes? Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, Amy, and absolutely. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Phil Reid, the Auckland-wide Planning Manager from Plans and Places, and we look after the unitary plan for Auckland. I'm giving oversight to our Principal Planner on this proposed rainwater tank plan change. As Andrew has touched on, there are many benefits to rainwater harvesting, including contributing to self-sufficiency, improving water resourcefulness, and managing stormwater runoff. So rainwater collection is certainly an area that we're keen to support the enablement of. However, we've found that there are some circumstances where the unitary plan has been overly restrictive in the placement of rainwater tanks on people's properties, which can commonly lead to resource consents being required. So the goal of this plan change is to make it easier for Aucklanders to install a rainwater tank by making them a permitted activity with more permissive guidelines on what is acceptable depending on the zone that you live in. It can be a confusing subject, so I'm here today to help clarify any questions in this space and help everyone understand the proposed plan change. Thanks, Amy.
Thanks, Phil. Okay, viewers, please be with us. We're going to go back to Chris and see if we can actually connect with Chris now. Thanks, Chris. Are you there?
Thanks there, Amy. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Fantastic. Kia ora and kia ora to everyone. Thanks very much and apologies for the technical difficulty. I was just introducing myself. I'm the Head of Sustainability at Watercare, and it's a pleasure to be part of the conversation with you all this evening. Watercare has been working closely with Council, with Andrew in particular, and with the Healthy Waters team over the last 12 months to look at the ways that we can work together and collaborate in this space, and also the opportunities to enable the greater uptake of rainwater tanks in Auckland. Watercare is aware of the benefits that they have and the opportunities for Aucklanders to become more resilient with their water supply, and that we're a part of this. So it's excellent to be part of the conversation this evening, and it's something that is really important to us as an organisation. We're keen to hear feedback from the community in this space, and I'll do my best to help with any questions that we might have tonight. Though I am not an expert on the plan changes itself, so I am here to support where I can and provide any information. We are, as an organisation, really aware that being resourceful and being clever with your use of water is really important, especially as our city continues to grow, and especially very important whilst our climate continues to change. There's a number of things that Watercare are already doing to support that resilience and the adaptation to climate change. In particular, as we know, with the water supply issues that we've had and the lack of rainfall over the previous summer, these are things that we've been focusing on a lot. And our organisation has been doing things behind the scenes, especially working with large water users, those that are non-residential, and the council family is absolutely a part of that. And we're doing some wonderful initiatives around reducing potable consumption. And actually that has been in the non-potable space as well. And we're seeing businesses absolutely look at solutions around non-potable as well. So there is lots of these things going on. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to have you and the other panelists here. I also want to apologise. I totally forgot to introduce myself. So my name's Amy Donovan, and I also work with Andrew in Healthy Waters. So to those of you who are joining us tonight, this evening it's a panel discussion about the proposed Auckland unitary plan changes relating to the installation of rainwater tanks. Andrew, can you please provide us with a bit of an overview of how the proposed unitary plan changes benefit Aucklanders and the environment?
Thanks, Amy. I'll have to go back a little bit to February 2019. So we started the process of developing a water strategy for Auckland, and as part of that process we undertook a public consultation with a discussion document called Our Water Future. And we're really looking at the whole gamut of the issues of water, both in water quality, water supply, how we grow, and climate change. The interesting thing is we got a huge amount of submissions. It was a topic that really struck a chord with many Aucklanders. And we got a huge proportion of those submissions where we should make rainwater tanks easier. 30% of submissions actually commented that we should make rain tanks easier for people to install. There wasn't even a question specifically focused on rain tanks. So after that, we got that feedback, we started the process of investigating what is it, what are the issues that people face when they want to have a rain tank installed in Auckland. And one of the key barriers that we identified when we surveyed rain tank suppliers, plumbers and drain layers was that a resource consent was needed in many cases. So if someone wants to go to the cost of installing a rain tank, often the charges and going through the process of getting a resource consent was just too much. They'd rather spend the money on something else. So we wanted to remove those barriers as a first step. And then of course we had the worst drought Auckland has ever experienced last summer. So the timing sort of aligned unfortunately well, and we've got the political support to accelerate putting through a plan change to remove those barriers. So the key benefits that we felt that rainwater tanks provide, it improves our efficiency of our household water use, as I said before. Resilience. So for example, Wellington Council subsidised 200 200-litre rain barrels for a lot of their community following the Kaikoura earthquakes, because they realised that if there were some catastrophic failures due to an earthquake of their articulated water system, they needed people to have a certain amount of water. And as you can see on the slide in the background, there's from the World Health Organization, they've sort of figured out how much water you need to survive a disaster based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So having a contingency water supply around your household just makes good sense. You never know when you might need it. I've also mentioned the stormwater benefits. When we develop our urban areas, we increase the amount of hard surfaces, and rainfall and runoff happens faster. So we get increased runoff volumes and increased flow rates. And this has a bad effect in Auckland because we have a lot of soft, muddy bottom streams. And the stream bank and stream bed erosion caused by that fast runoff contributes to the sedimentation in our harbours and waterways, particularly into those upper estuarine areas. And you get problems of mangrove ingress where people used to have white sandy beaches. And it's a real thorny issue in Auckland. Finally, there's an important value around connecting people to the water cycle. Once you have a rain tank and you're using that rain tank to water your garden and you start to be more connected with the weather cycles, we feel that enhances people's awareness and their values that they place on water. And keeping that level of awareness and enhancing the values people place on water helps motivate us for the long term that it's going to take to fix a lot of the water issues in Auckland. Now, I'll probably just be clear that when it comes to demand management and reducing the need for big water reticulation, rain tanks on their own don't do the job for us, but they are part of a suite of solutions that help our whole region become more resilient. So, Amy, have you anything you'd like to add there?
That was a very helpful introduction, Andrew. Thank you very much for that. Just before we move on, I was just going to quickly check with you. Could you please just explain a little bit more about the different types of consents involved, so the resource consent and the building consents?
Oh, of course. So building consents are required under the Building Act. So Auckland Council doesn't write the Building Act or the codes, but we administer Building Act compliance. So if you were to plumb your rainwater tank into your household plumbing and you need to comply with the rules in the Building Act and the Building Code, and you may well need a building consent. Likewise, if you put your rainwater tank high up on a structure so that it needs to be stable or could potentially fall over on someone, the Building Act comes into play. But if your tank is on the ground and it's connected to outside plumbing, you probably won't need a building consent. A resource consent, however, is related to the Resource Management Act, and the Auckland Council, in consultation with the public, prepares rules in the unitary plan, and whether or not your activity impacts on those rules depends whether or not you need a resource consent. And that's really the topic of today, is how can we help rain tanks be installed in many more situations so that they do not need a resource consent. And I'll probably let Phil describe the technical details of that lot. Thanks, Amy.
Thanks, Andrew. And over to you, Phil. If you could please expand on that, that'd be great.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, the unitary plan in setting those rules does treat at the moment rainwater tanks in a similar way to other types of buildings. So currently, rainwater tanks, by being over 1 metre in height, would be counted as a building. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that a resource consent is needed, but what it does do is it means that it is subject to all of the controls which relate to buildings. So where there are situations such as where you do want to put a rainwater tank along the side boundary of your house, potentially next to a downpipe, you may be within what's called a side yard. So if you look at this image in front of us here, on the right hand pane, we can see that there are some dotted lines alongside the house for the side boundary setback. And in most of our urban zones, that's a 1 metre setback space. And what we find is that as we become more intense over time as a city and the space around our houses becomes more constrained, we need to look at people's opportunities to be able to put features such as rainwater tanks onto their properties, given the overall sustainability benefits that they deliver. So whilst it may not be possible to locate a rainwater tank on many properties and not trigger the need for a resource consent, there are many situations where property owners are limited in considering the use of yards and may also exceed our site coverage controls. Now, site coverage is the maximum extent of your property that you can cover within buildings, and it's expressed as a percentage. But the key term there is buildings. So what we're looking at within this plan change is whether to exempt rainwater tanks from the definition of buildings, establish their own definition, provide for them as a permitted activity, and then to set down some particular rules governing where they may be able to be located on properties. And that includes things like the yard setbacks and whether or not they are subject to site coverage and outdoor space and outlook area controls that you can also see on that image. So this is a situation of not wanting to force people to require a resource consent and looking at maximising the opportunity for people to place rainwater tanks on their properties without the need for a resource consent, whilst at the same time still looking to control any objectionable elements that could be caused to neighbouring properties. Thank you, Amy.
Thanks, Phil. That's really helpful. I just had a sort of further question for you. Just can you please explain a bit about what's actually required and involved with the resource consent process? What sort of, how much of a barrier is it to actually getting a rainwater tank?
Thanks, Amy. Yes, I mean, a resource consent application does cost. So depending on the complexity of the application, people may face a processing cost by council, which can be in the order of $500 to $4,000. In addition to that, there would be additional costs in preparing that application to lodge with council. So we're quite cognizant of the barrier that this can actually place in front of people wishing to actually do the right thing and put rainwater tanks on their properties. So council have recently removed the requirement to pay for resource consents in the majority of circumstances for rainwater tanks, but the formal application process must still be followed, and this fee waiver can only really be a temporary measure. So what we're aiming to do with the plan change is to make getting a rainwater tank easier for people by removing the need for a resource consent in low risk situations. Basically, we're looking to remove rainwater tanks from the definition of building, as I said earlier, and create a new rainwater tank definition, which would then be found within our activity tables for our zones as a permitted activity. We would then have development standards that would apply for rainwater tanks, and we would tailor those standards to make it more enabling for people to place these on their properties, whilst at the same time still looking at some controls to protect any objectionable elements that can come from those rainwater tanks on surrounding properties. Hope that helps, Amy.
That is really helpful. Thank you very much, Phil. For those of you just joining us tonight, this is a live Q&A session about the proposed Auckland unitary plan changes relating to water tanks. So Phil was just explaining to us that in the current unitary plan, the rainwater tanks over 1 metre in height are considered to be a building. This may result in the tanks needing a resource consent, especially if they're placed close to the boundary or if they don't follow the rules of other development standards. Is that correct, Phil?
Yes, you got that one right, Amy.
That's great. Thanks, Phil. So just to reiterate, this is a Q&A session, so please do feel free to send your questions through and we'll answer them tonight. It is with the intention that this will be helpful in terms of you preparing your formal feedback. So if you'd like to make a formal submission, please head to AK Have Your Say to do so, and you should be able to see a link in the bottom of your panel on screen now. Chris, over to you. I do have a question. It's slightly off the plan change subject, but with regards to water tanks being plumbed into the household plumbing for toilet and laundry use, how will rainwater tanks be metered for wastewater discharge? Thanks, Chris.
Thanks very much, Amy. Yeah, it's a question that we do get, and it's specifically around how wastewater is charged for, and there's a number of different ways that we charge for it depending on the scenario of the individual Aucklander. But it's just bearing in mind that the reason we charge for wastewater is to ensure its maintenance and upkeep of the wastewater system, and to effectively treat and discharge that wastewater. So the fees are going to good use. The question first is whether you are going to be using it for outdoor use only. So if you are going to just be using it for your garden, to wash the boat, etc., no worries, no questions need to be asked about the metering or the wastewater side of it. And it does come, as you say, into question when we're looking at whether it's plumbed in, and you can plumb it in for your washing machine or for your toilet and that sort of thing. Here, the main question is around whether you are also connected to the mains water or not. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated. So for some people who are rainwater tank users, they might only be on a tank. Now, if they're only on a rainwater tank, that's their sole supply of water, there's two options there. One, you have a fixed fee, which is a fixed fee for your, so no meter required, just a fixed fee, and that covers an average amount of wastewater that you would use during the year, and it's not variable. However, what customers may want to do is have a bit more understanding of their wastewater fees. So you can get a meter that's applied specifically to your rainwater tank, and we take a percentage of that, which is assumed to go down the wastewater system, which is then used to cover those fees. The other side of things is when you have a mains supply, so you're getting water from the reticulated system, and you're also supplementing that with a rainwater tank. And this is where we're actually reviewing, as a secondary output of the work that we've been doing with Council, on the best way to approach that. But at the moment, we continue with a percentage, a fixed fee, which you have, smaller fixed fee component, and then a variable amount, which is actually provided on the amount of water that comes from the mains tap, so from the mains tank. So the meter isn't associated with the rainwater tank at all, and that comes as a percentage of the mains water supply that goes into your house, and therefore down the drain. Thank you, that was me.
Thanks for that detail, Chris. So it does look like if the proposed plan change do go through, that there are some sort of implications that will need to be thought through. Coming back to you, Andrew, around building consents, will this plan change actually remove the need and the requirement for a building consent?
No, the requirement for a building consent is still there. So as I said earlier, if you plumb your tank into your house, you are likely to need a building consent. And what the Building Act is concerned with is the risk of a thing called backflow. So if you're connected to the mains water and you have a rainwater tank, from a public health perspective, we've got to be quite careful that the two waters don't mix, so that your rainwater tank, which may not be as good quality as the mains water, if that can flow back into the mains, it can create a health risk, particularly to people that have immune issues and cannot stand the potential bugs that might be in a rainwater tank. So there's rules around backflow prevention, and there's also just your general plumbing rules. So whenever you do plumbing in a house, you should be getting a building consent, because you want to make sure that that plumbing is installed by an authorised plumber and is done to a standard, so it doesn't create other types of issues such as leakage and so forth within your house. But as I said before, if you're just plumbing it into your exterior plumbing, you're unlikely to need a building consent, and you put it on the ground, of course. If you suspend it up high on a tall stand, you may well need a building consent as well. I hope that answers that question for you, Amy.
Thanks, Andrew, for that detail. That was great. So, Phil, I have a question for you. What if my neighbour installs a tank and I don't like the way it looks? Am I able to do anything about that? Thanks, Phil.
Right, I think in answering this one, context is always important. So the first thing to do would be to look at what the actual zone is that the property is in, where the rainwater tank has been placed, with an eye to looking at what the side boundary or rear boundary setbacks are, or what the site coverage might be, or it could be that it is located somewhere like a special character area as well, which has additional controls around look and feel and design of structures. So the first thing to do would be to check the zoning of the property and check any other overlays, and that's where we actually go into the unitary plan maps and click on the property in question to actually look at what the zone and overlay controls are. From there, what we can do is actually go into the unitary plan to have a look at what those controls might be. So say for instance this is a rainwater tank which is say 3 metres high, which might be placed right on the boundary. Then in that situation, this rainwater tank could well have infringed the unitary plan by being a building, by being over 1 metre high, as I said earlier, and by being within a yard setback, say for instance within the side boundary setback of 1 metre that we looked at earlier, which is on the right-hand panel there. So in that sort of situation, the next door neighbour would have needed a resource consent to have placed that rainwater tank there. So that's where, from Council's perspective, we can help you by checking our files to see whether a resource consent was obtained. And if there wasn't one obtained, then obviously there can be a complaint that is made so that the person who put the rainwater tank in can go through the proper process to either get a resource consent to keep it where it is, or if they do not get the resource consent, then to move it away from that yard setback area to be able to comply with the unitary plan. Thank you, Amy.
That's great. Thank you very much, Phil. I was wondering, why is the plan change, Phil, concerned with height and not volume? And also, what about building coverage rules? You sort of touched on them, but will these be considered too? Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Amy. Yeah, height is probably the primary thing that we're interested in because it relates to dominance and whether there is a situation of where, as an adjoining property, where the neighbour does put a rainwater tank up, you lose that basic level of enjoyment that you expect from your own property. So that's where height plays a bigger role than volume. Volume tends to come in more strongly on things like stability with weight, which then is a matter which is more related to the Building Act itself. So for the unitary plan, we're focused on height as the main issue, which impacts on the amenity values of surrounding properties. But at the same time, we're very cognizant of the fact that we want this plan change to be enabling of people to put rainwater tanks in. So we're looking at whether or not there can be some infringements enabled through this plan change to the usual placement of buildings by property boundaries.
Andrew, we've got a question for you. If the tank is plumbed into the house, is there danger of people getting sick from the water that they're drinking? Is it drinkable water? Thanks, Andrew.
Now that's a good question. So if you're like me and you live in a rural area and a rainwater tank is your only supply, you should be putting that water through filters and even preferably a UV light system to make sure that any bugs are cleaned before it goes into your house. So if you do not treat the water from a rain tank that comes straight off your roof, there is a risk if you drink it. So that's why we actually really try to focus on people using that water for non-potable purposes, flushing toilets, washing machines if you have a main supply, or out in the garden. Most people who have rainwater tanks for their own supply will have some form of treatment system in place. I myself have got a couple of fine filters that make sure that none of the bugs, and we're talking protozoa and bacteria that live in the guts of birds in particular that can land on your roof and leave little deposits. You don't want that stuff going through into your drinking water. On the mains water, that's why they put chlorine there. They always maintain a chlorine residual, so if there's any bacteria or protozoa get into the water supply, it is killed off by the residual chlorine. I hope that answers that question for you, Amy.
Drew, thank you. Thank you for that detail. That's great. I do just want to take this opportunity to provide a bit of a recap, just in case you're joining us tonight. So we are here to talk about the proposed unitary plan change in relation to rainwater tank usage across Tamaki Makaurau. To recap, there are two types of consent that need to be used, a resource consent and a building consent. The goal with the proposed change is to redraft the unitary plan so that rainwater tanks won't require a resource consent in most scenarios. If you plumb your tank to your home's internal plumbing, a building consent is still needed, like Andrew was saying. So that is another area of work that Auckland Council is looking at, but it's separate to this particular stream of work, which is the unitary plan change itself. So the aim of the proposed plan change here is to remove the triggers that lead to the requirement for a resource consent in the majority of scenarios. I've actually now got a question for Phil. Phil, how did the proposed plan changes relate to the underground water tanks? Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, the intent of the plan change, as I said, was to be enabling. And one of the things we need to be able to look at are choices people make about whether rainwater tanks are fully above ground, partially above and below ground, or fully below ground. So what we're looking to do is where people do make that choice to actually place a rainwater tank fully below ground, we're looking to be able to exempt it from some of the current controls that we've got above and beyond what I've spoken about earlier. Now, one of these controls is the outlook space control, which you can see on the right-hand pane again there. What we're allowing for here are rainwater tanks to go within that outlook space, provided that they are actually underground. Now that's recognising the fact that the purpose of the outlook space is to support that openness concept and looking out from your windows and enablement of natural light to come in. And so we didn't want to be restrictive of choices about where people can place these around their houses. And so one of the ideas that we're investigating at the moment in this draft plan change is to look at being able to place rainwater tanks in that particular area where it is underground. Looking to that right panel again, you've got the front yard control, which is from the roadside back into the property. And we're also looking at the enablement of rainwater tanks to go within that space, where people actually can have them being less than 1 metre high. So that would in most cases require them to design a rainwater tank which is partially below ground and partially above ground in order to meet that. But that's another enablement that we want people to be able to have in their choices about where they place them. Generally, as you then go further back behind the house, then the choices are free there for people to have them fully above ground, a mix of above or below ground or below ground. Thank you.
Andrew, we've received a question that we're going to direct to you. How do you feel about waiving fees for discharge of volume from rainwater tanks? Water would form part of surface runoff from land in any case if it's not caught by a tank.
Oh, thanks, Amy. I don't think we charge people for discharging to the stormwater system from rainwater tanks as it stands right now. This might be a consideration for perhaps when you're connected to the wastewater network. So look, it is appropriate that if you're discharging to the wastewater network that some fees are paid, because those fees go towards the upkeep and maintenance of that network, as Chris said earlier. So I'm pretty sure we don't charge any fees for people to discharge water from rainwater tanks into the stormwater system. I'm certain of it. I'm sure we don't.
Okay.
Someone prove me wrong if I am, please.
Thank you for clarifying that, Andrew. Another question for you, Andrew, while we've got you. How do I know what size water tank to get? Any guidance for viewers tonight on that question?
That is a good question. The answer depends on how much water you need and really sort of how big your house is and how big your family is. The council does have some useful guidance. I'm pretty sure we can provide that on a link on to the people listening in tonight. But yeah, but essentially the more people or the more water you need, the more water storage you should probably get. If your house roof is also relatively large, you can get away with a slightly smaller rainwater tank. So it's a combination of your roof area and how much water you need, depending on how much storage you need. For those people that have rainwater tanks as their only supply, if you ran out of water or got close to running out of water last summer, particularly if you had to get a couple or more refills from a water carrier, we highly recommend you consider getting an additional rainwater tank before the summer. So how's that, Amy?
Good advice, Andrew. No, thank you. That's great. Phil, question for you about the actual unitary plan change process. When are we likely to hear the outcome of the proposed plan change? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. We're looking to be able to notify this plan change in about another 3 or 4 weeks' time. What we do need to do under the RMA is actually go through a formal process where we call for submissions. Once the submissions are received, we summarise those submissions and give people an opportunity to submit either for or against other people's submissions. And we then need to write a hearing report and hold a hearing. So in all likelihood, we'd be able to hold a hearing probably in February next year, and then look to the hearing commissioners to release a decision. And depending on any appeals, all going well, we could potentially get a plan change operative and in place by March or early April next year.
Thank you very much for that, Phil. And Chris, I was just wondering if you'd like an opportunity to speak to the previous question as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amy, and thanks to the person who submitted the question regarding the size of the rainwater tank. As Andrew said, it's going to be absolutely dependent on the individual circumstances, but it is the main consideration is size. So how big can you get it within the constraints that you have to ensure that it's safe and that it's amenable for your neighbours, etc., etc. We are, as Watercare, really aware over the previous summer, as Andrew mentioned, that rain tanks are fantastic when it rains, but during the middle of summer, when it's not raining, then the demand is put back onto the metropolitan supply. And the opportunity here is to ensure that you have as large a tank as you possibly can. Aucklanders will also be aware that currently there are water restrictions in place for the use for outdoor watering, and a good sized water tank will ensure that you're able to keep the garden looked after and the grass of your lawn looked after over summer, as we are expecting another dry one to come after this spring. So I don't have a technical answer to that one, but size is king where we have the opportunity to do so. Cheers.
Thank you very much for that, Chris. Andrew, a question for you. Is it worth converting a stormwater detention tank to a reuse tank? And I wonder if in your answer, could you please just describe the difference between those two uses? Thank you.
Okay, Amy, I'll do my best to keep it simple. So a stormwater detention tank is designed to fill up with the water from your roof and then drain slowly back into the stormwater network. And the idea of this is that it reduces the speed of the runoff so that we protect our streams and waterways from that high velocity runoff. A reuse tank, of course, is where half of the tank might be used to fill up and drain slowly, and then the bottom half is kept for using on your garden and reusing around your section. So is it worth it to convert a stormwater detention tank into a detention and reuse tank? You know, it's going to depend a lot on the configuration of your existing tank. Many of the stormwater detention tanks have been installed below ground, so that they're under driveways, so getting access to them is quite hard. And to reuse that water, you may need a pump. So I would carefully weigh up whether or not the cost of installing a pump and the valving and the pipe work that you need to reuse that water in your tank is worth it, or simply just getting an additional rainwater tank that you can mount on the surface, and you don't need to put in the more expensive pumps and plumbing machinery. So it's definitely a site-by-site consideration, but it's certainly possible. One of the key things that you need to think about is if you do reuse your stormwater tank, you do, and that tank may be a requirement of a resource consent, you will need to make sure that your tank is emptied enough before each rainfall event so that it still serves its stormwater purpose of capturing a volume of water before releasing it slowly out into the environment. Does that answer your question, Amy?
Certainly does. No, thank you, Andrew. That's excellent. Phil, we've got a question there around, what's the relevance of this plan change for rural properties? Does it actually have an impact, or is it really largely just looking at urban properties and their rainwater tank use? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. I mean, the issue relates obviously to both. I mean, rainwater tank in rural areas reduce the need for water tank deliveries, which are in turn draining on the municipal supply. So the plan change is also looking to make it more enabling for our rural properties as well. So in order to do that, what we're looking at in the draft is being very clear about the fact that it would be a permitted activity to place a rainwater tank in all of the rural zones. There are some issues in relation to some of the rural zones, such as the rural coastal zone that has quite a natural landscape character protection basis to it. So we are looking at potentially some controls around the colour choices that you might have to actually make sure that they fit in with the natural character of those areas. But otherwise, the controls in rural zones are very enabling, given the site sizes and often the proximity of dwellings to boundaries which tend to be further away. So we're just trying to make it really clear in the rural zones that it is a permitted activity to carry this out.
Thanks very much, Phil. And while we've still got you, just another question for you. Will the proposed changes be applied differently to new homes versus retrofitting existing homes?
We do have in some locations within Auckland through the unitary plan some special provisions that are already in place requiring of rainwater tanks to be put in place for new development of new builds. So examples of that we find in places like the Long Bay area and Hobsonville. But generally speaking, across the rest of urban Auckland, there aren't any such controls requiring of rainwater tanks to go in. So we're enabling this plan change. It's not a requirement basis to this plan change. And we're equally enabling people to put rainwater tanks in as a design choice as part of a new build or as a choice as part of an existing house, so to be able to look after existing gardens and those sort of things. So the unitary plan for existing areas doesn't differentiate between whether it's a new build or a retrofit.
Thank you, Phil. So, Chris, apologies if I missed the answer to this question, but how will Watercare be notified if I install a rainwater tank and have this plumbed to my household non-potable supply? Is it up to the householder, or does the RC or BC process, resource consents or building consent process, trigger a notification to Watercare? Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. A very insightful question. It is fair to say at the moment that there isn't an existing process for this exact scenario. There is during a new build, but if a person was looking to retrofit their water tank into their plumbed system, then it would be up to that homeowner to give Watercare a call and let them know. However, we are actually reviewing this current process to see whether it's fit for purpose for what we're trying to achieve and with the enablement of rainwater tanks. So that is a watch this space at the moment.
Andrew, did you want to add to that at all around the resource consent and building consent process?
No, so for existing households, I know we don't have those processes in place to capture the information. We do want to, in future, have a much better understanding of how many rainwater tanks there are in the region, particularly for both stormwater use and for rainwater harvesting reuse. A lot of that helps us with our modelling and understanding the effects, the beneficial effects of what's happening with the community uptake and how much we can rely on that to improve our water quality. But that's going to be some time in the making. So I agree with Chris's comments that these are processes that we have to work on and improve.
Thanks, Andrew. And while we're with you, who's responsible for the maintenance of rainwater tanks?
So yeah, the owner of the tank is responsible for maintaining them. And I'd probably want to add that it's not just your rainwater tank that you need to be thinking about maintaining. Your guttering and your downpipes in particular, you want to take good care of. So if you've got lots of tall trees around your house and that leaf fall gets in your gutters, it'll get washed into your tank if you don't have like good leaf guards and those kind of protections. And when that detritus gets into your tank, it will rot and it will taint the water, and a sediment will build up that could damage pumps and other types of fittings. So it's up to the property owner to maintain their tank, and not just your tank. All of your downspouting and plumbing should be regularly looked after. And I would encourage people to make sure before this summer in particular that all of those maintenance jobs are done. It's a good time to spring clean and sort them out, because as Chris said, we are facing a bit of a dry spring, and when it does rain, you want as much of that rain to be captured in your tank as possible. Thanks, Amy.
Very much, Andrew. So, Phil, last question for you now. What are the standard heights for rainwater tanks? Why has this been asked as part of the plan change?
Well, remember earlier I spoke about 1 metre being the threshold for what is counted as a building, and therefore subject to all of the rules and standards that sit within the unitary plan at the moment. So in looking to be more enabling, we need to actually have an eye to what it is that the market provides as rainwater tanks. So the common above ground tank sizes used in urban areas are between around about sort of 1.8 and 3 metres high. So that's sort of the parameters that we've been looking at based on your choices in the market. And so therefore we're actually looking at what are the implications of tanks of those sizes when they're placed at different parts around people's properties.
Thanks very much, Phil. And thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. So just a bit of a recap. We're here with a live Q&A session with Auckland Council panellists and a representative from Watercare to talk about the proposed unitary plan changes in relation to water tanks. Any questions that have been asked tonight will be made available on the website, so please do keep sending them through. We are, however, at the end of tonight's discussion, so I'd like to give our panellists the final opportunity to provide any closing statements. So Andrew, over to you. Thank you.
Well, it's just a closing statement. I'll just like to add, for those people in the rural communities that ran out of water, if you think now's a really good time to think about getting another rain tank. And really the whole rationale behind what we're trying to do and making rain tanks easier is just for the situation that is exactly for the type of situation that we can be facing this summer. The more storage you have, the safer you'll be. So thank you very much for listening, everyone, and I hope you get the chance to install a rain tank soon.
Thanks, Andrew. Chris, over to you.
Thanks very much, and yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks, Amy. Yeah, just a final word from me is just to think about water being a precious resource, and this discussion is absolutely part of that. Watercare has recently relaunched a website called waterforlife.org.nz, and that's got a bunch of resources around being more water efficient in your home, including some information around rainwater tanks. So if anyone is keen and interested, then it's waterforlife.org.nz. And best of luck with the next steps and with your submissions. Thanks very much, Amy, and for everyone listening.
Thank you, Chris. And lastly, Phil.
Thanks, Amy. I suppose as a message, I just really want to stress that we are truly in a draft phase for considering what this plan change has within it. So I've been looking through, and my staff have been looking through the feedback that's come in so far, and I just really want to encourage people to actually put that feedback in so that we can make this plan change as accurate and as strong as possible when we notify it. So we'll be looking to notify this plan change hopefully on the 9th of October. So keep an eye out for that when it is publicly notified, and you may want to put a submission in as well. And all going well, we'll try and get this update into the unitary plan and improve our rules as quickly as possible early next year. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Phil, and thank you to the panellists. So we're at the end of tonight's discussion. I just want to take this opportunity to thank everybody who's helped make tonight's success behind the scenes. To our viewers watching from home or work, thank you very much for joining us. If you are planning on making a submission, please do so. Please go to AK Have Your Say and make your submission. Provide your feedback. before the 23rd of September this month. As mentioned, a recording will be made available of any of the questions asked prior, during or after tonight's session. They will also be posted on AKA Have Your Say website. So again, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you found this useful. Thank you. Good night.